Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Thaddeus Rook had been working the night shift along Minnesota's North Shore for 23 years, and he thought he'd heard every kind of emergency call that could come through the radio. Drunk drivers on Highway 61. Lost hikers near the Sawtooth Mountains. The occasional domestic dispute that required a careful hand and a calm voice. At 51, Rook had earned his reputation as a steady presence in the small communities scattered between Duluth and the Canadian border, where the land dropped away into Lake Superior and the nearest backup could be 40 minutes away on a good night. The call came in at 2:17 on a November morning, the kind of deep cold that turned your breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. Dispatch forwarded it with an unusual note in her voice, something Rook couldn't quite place. "Sheriff, we've got a 911 from up near Split Rock. Caller says there's someone in her house. Line's still open, but she's not responding anymore." Rook was already turning his cruiser around, heading north on the empty highway. Address? That's the thing. She gave 4712 Lakeshore Drive, but that address doesn't exist. The road ends at 4200, and there's nothing past that but state forest. Dispatch paused. "Audio's strange, too. You'll want to hear this." She patched through the recording. A woman's voice, elderly, steady, despite the circumstances. "There's someone walking through my house. I can hear them downstairs. My husband died last winter, and I'm alone here now. Please send someone." The dispatcher's response, calm and professional, asking standard questions. Then the woman again, but this time her voice had changed slightly, flattened somehow. "They're coming up the stairs. The third step always creaks, but I don't hear it creaking. Tell whoever comes that the lights won't work. They never work when this happens." The recording ended with breathing, slow and measured, but whether it was the caller or someone else, Rook couldn't tell. He pushed the cruiser faster, watching the dark shapes of pine trees blur past in his headlights. Lake Superior stretched out to his right, a vast darkness beneath the starless sky. When he reached the turnoff for Lakeshore Drive, his GPS showed nothing but forest ahead. He radioed his position and continued anyway, following the narrow road as it wound closer to the cliff edge. At 4200, the pavement ended abruptly, replaced by gravel. Rook slowed, scanning the trees with his spotlight. No houses, no driveways, just the sound of waves hitting the rocks 200 feet below. He was about to turn back when he saw it. A driveway, barely visible, overgrown with brush but recently disturbed. Fresh tire tracks, maybe a day old. He followed them for a quarter mile until a house materialized from the darkness, a two-story structure that looked like it had been built in the 50s, weathered siding and a sagging porch. No lights in any window. Rook killed his engine and sat for a moment, listening. The wind off the lake carried the smell of ice and rotting leaves. His radio crackled with static, which wasn't unusual this far north, but when he tried to call in his location, he got nothing but white noise. He checked his cell phone. No signal. He approached the house with his flashlight and weapon drawn, calling out standard announcements. "Sheriff's Department. Ma'am, are you here? This is Sheriff Rook responding to your call." The front door was unlocked, swinging open at his touch. Inside, the house was furnished but felt abandoned in a way that had nothing to do with dust or cobwebs. The furniture was there, arranged as if someone lived here, but the air had that held breath quality of a place that had been empty for a very long time. His flashlight beam caught family photos on the mantel. A couple, maybe in their 70s, standing in front of this same house. The woman in the photo had the kind of face that smiled easily, laugh lines deep around her eyes. Rook moved through the downstairs, checking rooms. Kitchen table set for two. A coat hanging by the door. Everything ordinary except for the feeling that crawled up his spine. The sensation of being watched from the dark corners his flashlight couldn't quite reach. The stairs were carpeted, muffling his footsteps. He counted them as he climbed. The third step made no sound at all when his weight pressed down on it, but he could feel something wrong with it, a slight give that shouldn't be there. At the top, 3 bedroom doors stood open. He cleared each one methodically. Empty. The beds were made. The closets held clothes that looked decades out of style. In the master bedroom, his flashlight found a telephone on the nightstand. An old rotary model, the cord severed cleanly about a foot from the base. On the bed lay a blanket, folded with precision, and on top of it, a note written in shaky handwriting. I called every night for 3 months after he died. No one ever came. I don't think I'm here anymore. I think I've been gone for a long time, but I can still hear him walking through the house. The third step never creaks for him. Rook's radio suddenly erupted with voice, startling him. Deputy Lyle Fenwick, calling from what sounded like very far away. Sheriff, we found something. County records show a Greta Hollander died in a house fire at an address near Split Rock 2 years ago. There was an investigation because she'd called 911 multiple times in the weeks before, reporting an intruder, but officers could never find anyone. The house burned to the foundation. There's nothing left at that location. Rook stood in the bedroom, his flashlight trained on the note. Lyle, I'm standing in a house right now. It's furnished. There are photos on the wall. Static filled the silence. Then Fenwick's voice came back, breaking up. Sheriff, what address are you at? 4712 Lakeshore Drive. More static. When Fenwick spoke again, his voice was tight. Sir, I'm looking at property records. That lot is empty land, has been for 40 years. State bought it in 1982 after the previous structure was condemned. Rook turned slowly, his light sweeping across the room. In the window's reflection, he saw his own face, and behind him, for just a fraction of a second, another figure standing in the doorway. Tall, lean, utterly still. He spun, but the doorway was empty. His heart hammered against his ribs. He descended the stairs quickly, no longer counting them, no longer caring about procedure. The front door stood where he'd left it, open to the November cold. As he crossed the threshold, his radio crackled again. This time it was the original call, playing back. The elderly woman's voice. Tell whoever comes that the lights won't work. They never work when this happens. Then another voice, younger, confused. When, what happens? It was his own voice. He hadn't spoken those words, but there they were on the recording, time-stamped at 2:47, 6 minutes from now. Rook ran to his cruiser. The engine turned over on the first try, and he reversed down the driveway faster than was safe, branches scraping both sides of the vehicle. When he reached the main road, his headlights caught something that made him brake hard. The driveway he'd just exited was gone. In its place was unbroken forest, the brush undisturbed, no tire tracks, no indication anything had ever been there. He drove back to the station in silence, his radio off, his hands shaking slightly on the wheel. By the time he arrived, dawn was starting to gray the eastern sky. Fenwick met him in the parking lot, his expression concerned. Sheriff, you okay? You stopped responding. Rook climbed out of the cruiser and looked at the passenger seat. The note from the bedroom lay there, the paper old and brittle. He picked it up carefully and handed it to Fenwick. "Run this for Prince, and pull everything we have on Greta Hollander. I need to know who her husband was and what happened in those weeks before the fire." The investigation took 3 days. Greta Hollander had indeed called emergency services 17 times in the 2 months before her death, always reporting the same thing. Someone walking through her house at night. Someone who made no sound on the 3rd step of her stairs. Officers had responded to every call, found nothing, and eventually began to suspect dementia or loneliness after her husband's death. The husband, Robert Hollander, had died of a heart attack 6 months before Greta. He'd been a long-haul trucker, gone for weeks at a time, and neighbors said Greta had never adjusted to living alone. The fire that killed her had started in the kitchen, officially ruled accidental, a pot left on the stove. But the investigators' notes mentioned something odd. Greta's body had been found at the top of the stairs, not in the kitchen. She'd been facing down the staircase when she died from smoke inhalation, as if she'd been watching something, or waiting for something. Fenwick pulled phone records from the night of Rook's call. "Sheriff, there's no record of any 911 from that location. The system shows nothing incoming at 217, but there is something. At 247, there's a 6-second call from a disconnected number. No voice, just an open line. 247. The timestamp on his own voice in the recording, speaking words he'd never said. Rook returned to Lakeshore Drive alone the following night, arriving at exactly 217. He parked where he'd parked before and waited, his radio on, his phone recording. The forest was absolutely still, no wind, no sound of waves despite being so close to the lake. At 2:47, his radio hissed to life, the same elderly voice. "There's someone walking through my house." But this time there was more. "I can see him now. It's not Robert. It was never Robert. It's something else. Something that learned his walk, learned the way he moved through the rooms. But it forgot about the 3rd step. That step creaked every time for 30 years. Whatever this is, it doesn't make the step creak." The transmission ended. Rook sat in his cruiser, staring into the dark forest. His headlights illuminated the trees, the undergrowth, the empty space where a driveway should be. He started his engine and backed away slowly, watching his mirrors. In the rear view, just for a moment, he saw lights in the trees. House lights, yellow and warm, arranged in the pattern of windows. He didn't stop driving until he reached the highway, and when he looked back, there was only darkness. He filed his report, including everything. Fenwick read it without comment and then locked it in a cabinet marked for unsolved cases. Neither of them spoke about what it might mean, that a dead woman's calls were still coming through, still reaching across whatever distance separates the living from something else. Neither of them wanted to consider what it meant that she was still trying to warn someone, still trying to explain about the 3rd step and the thing that had learned to walk like her husband but couldn't quite get it right. Rook worked the North Shore for another 8 years before retiring. He never took another call for that section of Lakeshore Drive, and when new deputies asked why that stretch of road wasn't on the patrol rotation, Fenwick would shake his head and change the subject. The calls kept coming, though, every few months. Always at 2:17 in the morning. Always the same voice. Dispatch stopped responding to them after the 4th occurrence, marking them as system errors, but they logged them anyway. A record of something that kept happening. Something that needed help that couldn't arrive because the address didn't exist, and the caller had been dead for years. On winter nights when the wind comes off Lake Superior and the temperature drops below 0, Rook sometimes wakes at 2:17 exactly. He lies in the dark of his retirement cabin, listening, half expecting his old radio to crackle to life with that voice, that steady elderly voice explaining about the footsteps, and the 3rd step, and the thing that learned to walk like a man. He never hears it, but he wonders if somewhere, in a house that exists and doesn't exist, the phone still rings. And he wonders what answers when someone finally picks up. Sheriff Cyrus Keating had grown up in Minnesota's Iron Range, where the abandoned mines dotted the landscape like open wounds, and the forests reclaimed what the mining companies left behind. At 46, he'd spent his entire career in these communities, first as a deputy, then as sheriff of a county where everybody knew everybody, and the winters stretched from October to May. The old-timers still talked about the mines the way some people talk about lost family members, with a mixture of pride and sorrow for something that had given them life and then slowly bled them dry. The pickup truck was found on a Tuesday morning in March, parked at an odd angle on a logging road that hadn't been maintained in 20 years. A surveyor working for the Forestry Service spotted it and called it in, saying the situation felt wrong somehow, though he couldn't articulate why. Keating drove out with the morning sun barely clearing the pines, the roads still slick with ice despite the calendar saying spring was coming. The truck belonged to Otto Blakely, a 72-year-old retired forest ranger who lived alone in a cabin near the old Mesabi Range. Keating had known Otto for years. A careful man who could read the woods like most people read newspapers, not the type to abandon his vehicle for no reason. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition, engine cold. Otto's wallet and phone sat on the dashboard, which ruled out robbery or someone running from something in a panic. What caught Keating's attention were the tracks. Fresh boot prints in the mud and snow, leading from the driver's seat directly into the forest. Only one set, no return prints. Otto had walked into the trees and simply never walked back. The prints were evenly spaced, not running, not stumbling. Just walking with purpose into the dense woods as if he knew exactly where he was going. Keating radioed for the search team and waited, studying the scene. The road was empty in both directions. No other vehicles, no signs of anyone else present. Above, the sky was that flat gray that promised more snow. The trees seemed to lean in, watching, the way they always did in these old forests where the mining companies had dug too deep and left things hollow underneath. The search began at noon. 8 volunteers and 2 deputies spreading out in a grid pattern from the truck. They called Otto's name until their voices went hoarse, the sound swallowed by the forest. By nightfall, they'd covered a square mile and found nothing except Otto's tracks, which continued for about 300 yards before simply stopping. Not at a river or a cliff or any natural boundary. They stopped in the middle of a small clearing, as if Otto had taken one more step and ceased to exist. Keating studied the clearing as the searchlights swept across it. The ground was disturbed in a perfect circle, maybe 20 feet in diameter. The snow and mud churned up as if something had spun around repeatedly in that spot. But there were no other footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to explain the disturbance. At the center of the circle, pressed into the half-frozen mud, was Otto's pocket watch, the one he'd carried for 40 years. The crystal was cracked, and the hands had stopped at 11:17. They expanded the search over the next 3 days, bringing in dogs and a helicopter. The canines lost the scent at the clearing and refused to cross into the circle of disturbed ground, whining and pulling back on their leads. One of the handlers, a woman who'd worked search and rescue for 15 years, shook her head. "I've never seen dogs react like this. It's like there's something in that spot they can recognize, but we can't." On the 4th day, Keating visited Otto's cabin, looking for any clue about why he might have been on that logging road. The cabin was neat, organized, everything in its place. On Otto's desk lay a hand-drawn map covered in notations, sections of the old mine networks marked with dates and times. Beside the map was a journal, and Keating sat down to read it with growing unease. The entries dated back 6 months. Otto had been documenting strange sounds in the forest, vibrations he felt through the ground, animals behaving oddly near the abandoned mine entrances. February 8th, heard the calling again. 3 nights in a row now. Sounds like machinery deep underground, but all the mines in this sector have been closed for 30 years. Check the Buchanan shaft entrance. Fresh dirt outside like something's been digging from underneath. The entries grew more detailed. Otto had begun exploring the old mine sites, finding evidence of recent activity despite the mines being sealed decades ago. Cave-ins that had been excavated. Timber supports replaced. Tracks in the mine tunnels that didn't match any animal he recognized. His last entry was dated the morning of his disappearance. The calling was so loud last night I couldn't sleep. It's coming from the northwestern section, near where the Messaby and Buchanan networks connect. I need to see what's down there. If I'm right about what I'm hearing, people need to know what's waking up. Keating showed the journal to a geologist from the state university. The woman spent an afternoon with the maps and then sat back, troubled. These mines are unstable. The companies over-extracted, took out too much iron ore, left the support structures compromised. But that's not what concerns me. Look at these notations about the vibrations. If he was feeling them this strongly, and they're coming from the sealed sections, something down there is generating enough force to transmit through solid rock. That's not natural settling, that's active movement. Keating organized a team to check the mine entrance Otto had mentioned in his journal. They found the Buchanan shaft 2 miles from where the truck was discovered. The entrance sealed with concrete and steel bars according to the abandonment records from 1979. Except the seal was broken. Someone had chipped away enough concrete to create an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh marks on the steel showed recent tool work. Inside the opening, darkness extended downward at a 45-degree angle. Against his better judgment, Keating descended into the mine with 2 deputies and a mining safety expert the county had hired as a consultant. The air smelled of rust and damp stone, and something else, a sharp metallic scent that reminded Keating of blood. Their flashlights revealed tunnel walls shored up with timber that should have rotted away decades ago, but looked almost new. The ground beneath their feet was disturbed, dragged marks in the dirt leading deeper into the mine. They followed the marks for a 1/4 mile, descending steadily. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where several passages intersected, and here they found evidence that stopped them cold. Equipment, modern LED work lights, fresh tool marks on the walls, and a smell so strong it made Keating's eyes water. In one corner of the chamber sat a pile of clothes folded neatly. Otto's jacket, his boots, his flannel shirt. But no sign of Otto himself. On the chamber wall, someone had carved words into the rock, fresh cuts that gleamed white against the darker stone. It called, and I answered. The sound goes so deep, deeper than the mind's ever reached, deeper than anyone knows. It wants to come up now. It's been waiting so long. The mining expert checked her instruments and went pale. We need to leave. Now. These readings don't make sense. The air pressure is wrong, temperature is 15 degrees higher than it should be this far down, and I'm getting seismic readings that indicate active shifting beneath us. As if in response to her words, a sound rolled through the tunnels. Low, resonant, like enormous machinery grinding to life somewhere in the depths. The timber supports creaked. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. They ran, scrambling back up the slope, the sound following them, growing louder, vibrating through their bones. Behind them, they heard something else. Footsteps, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronized rhythm, coming up from the deeper passages. They emerged into daylight and immediately called for the mine to be resealed. The engineering crew arrived the next morning. But before they could start work, Nurse Marin Quill from the county hospital called Keating with a strange report. A man had walked into the emergency room an hour before dawn, confused and disoriented. He gave his name as Otto Blakely. Keating drove to the hospital at speeds that would have gotten anyone else a ticket. Otto was sitting in an examination room, wearing a hospital gown, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. When Keating entered, Otto looked up, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed wrong. The pupils too large, reflecting light in a way human eyes shouldn't. "Sheriff," Otto said, his voice hoarse, "I don't know how I got here. I remember walking into the forest. I heard the calling, the sound from underground. It was so clear, so perfect. I followed it to the mine entrance, and then—" He trailed off, struggling. "Then I was walking on the highway in the dark, 3 miles from my truck. No memory of the days between. What happened to me?" The medical examination revealed Otto was physically unharmed, but suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition consistent with not eating or drinking for several days. His clothes were missing, his body temperature was elevated, and when they drew blood for tests, the needle bent against his skin 3 times before finally penetrating, as if his skin had become denser somehow. Keating stayed with Otto through the afternoon, asking careful questions. "Do you remember going into the mine? Do you remember the chamber?" Otto's expression flickered, something moving behind his eyes. There were others down there. I wasn't alone. They came when the calling started. Some of them had been down there for a long time. Years, maybe. They showed me what was deeper, in the old networks below the iron ore veins. The places the mining companies never reached because the equipment couldn't go that deep. There's a network down there that wasn't made by miners. What kind of network? The kind that was there before the mines, before the trees, before anything human came to this land. Otto's hands trembled. It's been waiting, growing, spreading through the empty spaces we left behind when we pulled out the iron. Every tunnel we abandoned became a pathway for it. And now it's big enough, strong enough. It's ready to come up. Over the next week, 3 more people walked into the county hospital in the same condition. All of them had been reported missing from the area around the old mine sites. All of them returned with no memory of the time between, with slightly wrong eyes and elevated body temperatures. All of them spoke about the calling, the sound that drew them underground, the thing that was ready to emerge. Keating had the mine sealed with concrete poured 6 feet deep at every entrance in a 10-mile radius. The State Geological Survey was brought in and performed scans of the subsurface network. Their findings were classified, but the project supervisor told Keating, off the record, that the scans showed anomalies in the deep tunnels. Structures that showed geometric patterns not consistent with natural cave formation or mining operations. Hollow spaces that extended far below the depth any mine had reached, some of them large enough to hold buildings. The vibrations stopped after the sealing was complete. For 2 months, the forest was quiet. Then people began reporting the sound again, but this time it was coming from different locations. Not the sealed mines, but from the forest itself, from the ground, as if the network beneath had found other ways to reach the surface. Animals started avoiding certain areas. Trees in specific groves died overnight, their roots severed as if something had moved beneath them. Keating made one final entry in his case file before marking it closed. Otto Blakely was found and returned to his family. His condition remains unusual, but he is alive. Whatever exists beneath the abandoned mines is still there, contained for now by the seals. Continued monitoring is recommended. However, based on conversations with geological experts, we must acknowledge that the mine network extends far beyond our ability to seal. Some passages go too deep. Some connections are too numerous. If something is down there, if it's been growing in the spaces we left behind, we may have only delayed its emergence, not prevented it. Otto lives in a care facility now. His eyes never quite returned to normal, and he sleeps poorly, waking often to report hearing the calling again, growing stronger. Others who were found report the same thing. They gather sometimes. The ones who went into the mines and came back changed, and they talk about what they saw in the darkness. They talk about the tunnels that weren't made by human hands, about the thing that's been waiting beneath the iron ranges for something. They won't say what. Keating retired last year. He moved to the southern part of the state as far from the Iron Range as he could manage while still staying in Minnesota. But sometimes, late at night, he feels it through the floor of his house. A vibration, faint but steady, coming from deep in the earth. A rhythm that sounds almost like machinery, or almost like breathing. He tells himself it's just the natural settling of the ground, but he knows better. He knows that somewhere beneath Minnesota, in the empty spaces left behind by 100 years of mining, something is still calling. And eventually, the ones who heard it will have to answer. All of them. Not just Otto and the others who went down into the dark. Everyone. When it finally comes up, when it finds its way through the network of abandoned tunnels and hollow spaces, when it emerges into daylight, there will be nowhere far enough away to escape the calling. The sound that goes so deep, deeper than anyone knows, deeper than anyone ever should have dug. Sheriff Elijah Varnum had worked the Boundary Waters region for 19 years, long enough to respect the wilderness that stretched along the Canadian border, where lakes numbered in the thousands and the forests could swallow a person whole. At 53, he understood that nature up here had its own rules. Rules that didn't much care about human expectations or needs. The cold could kill you in an hour. The distance between help and disaster was measured in miles of roadless forest and frozen water. People vanished in these woods sometimes, and not all of them were found come spring thaw. The call came from boat warden Henley Pritchard, who worked the waterways during open season and ran ice patrols in winter. Henley was driving across Lake Kabetogama on his snowmobile when he noticed something that didn't track right. Footprints on the ice, a single line of them, starting about 200 yards from shore and heading toward the center of the lake. No corresponding tracks leading to where they began. Just prints appearing in the middle of the ice, as if someone had materialized from empty air and started walking. Varnum met Henley on the lake that afternoon, the temperature at 8 below zero and dropping fast with sunset coming early the way it did in January. The warden had marked the location with surveyor's tape, and Varnum could see what had troubled him. The prints were clear despite yesterday's light snow, boot treads pressed deep into the ice surface. They walked in a straight line toward the deepest part of the lake, each step evenly spaced, no deviation in the path. I followed them for half a mile, Henley said, his breath fogging in the cold. They just keep going, never turn, never stop, just heading straight out. And look at this. He knelt beside one of the prints. See how deep they're pressed? That's weight, real weight. This isn't some kind of hoax with fake prints. Someone walked here. Varnum studied the ice around them. Lake Kabetogama was one of the larger lakes in the Boundary Waters, covering over 25,000 acres. In winter, the ice typically froze to 3 feet thick, solid enough to drive a truck across. The prints continued as far as he could see, a lonely trail across the white expanse. Anyone missing in the area? Not reported yet. But you know how it is up here. Some of these cabins are so isolated, could be days before anyone notices someone's gone. They followed the tracks as the sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the ice. The line never wavered, heading toward the lake's center with geometric precision. After a mile, Varnum realized they were approaching an area fishermen avoided, a section where the lake bottom dropped away sharply into a trench nearly 200 feet deep. Old-timers claimed strange things about this part of the lake, about fish that came up wrong, about ice that sang on quiet nights. The tracks ended at a hole in the ice, not a fishing hole cut by an auger, but a perfect circle, maybe 4 feet across, the edges smooth as if melted rather than broken. The water in the hole was absolutely still, black and deep, reflecting nothing. Around the hole, the ice for about 10 feet in every direction was covered in a thin layer of frost that sparkled in their flashlight beams. But when Varnum touched it, the frost felt warm, almost body temperature. Jesus, Henley breathed. Did they fall through? Varnum shook his head slowly. The hole was too perfect, too circular, and the ice around it was undisturbed except for the single line of footprints leading directly to its edge. No signs of struggle, no cracks radiating outward the way they would if someone had broken through. Just that pristine hole and the warm frost, and the prints that ended exactly at the rim. He radioed for the dive team, but the response wasn't what he wanted to hear. Water temperature beneath the ice was hovering near 32 degrees. A dive at this temperature in these depths was borderline suicidal even with cold water gear. They'd need to wait for proper equipment and personnel from Duluth, which meant at least 12 hours. That night, Varnum stayed at the station, going through missing person reports. Nothing current, but he pulled historical files and found something that made him pause. 15 years ago, an ice fisherman had reported finding similar tracks on the same lake, in roughly the same area. The case was investigated but ultimately dismissed as unexplained. No one had been reported missing, the tracks couldn't be followed to their origin, and the ice showed no signs of anyone breaking through. At 3 a.m, his phone rang. Schoolteacher Una Caldecott, who lived in a cabin on the lake's north shore, her voice tight with something between fear and confusion. "Sheriff Varnum, I'm sorry to call so late, but there's someone walking on the ice. I can see them from my window. They're heading away from shore, straight out toward the deep water." Varnum was in his truck before she finished speaking. The drive to Una's cabin took 20 minutes on roads that were more ice than asphalt. She met him on her porch, wrapped in a heavy coat, pointing toward the lake. In the moonlight, he could just make out a figure moving across the ice, too far away to identify but close enough to see their steady, unhurried pace, walking in a straight line toward the center of the lake. He grabbed his spotlight and snowmobile and went after them, the machine's engine shattering the frozen silence. As he got closer, the figure became clearer. A man, wearing what looked like summer clothes, jeans, and a light jacket, completely inadequate for the sub-zero temperature. No hat, no gloves, moving at that same steady pace the tracks from earlier had shown, never turning to look at the approaching spotlight. Varnum pulled alongside, shouting over the engine, "Sir, stop right there, Sheriff's Department." The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the presence of the snowmobile now pacing him. Varnum got a good look at his face in the spotlight beam and felt his stomach drop. The skin was gray, waxy. The eyes were open but seeing nothing, or seeing something Varnum couldn't perceive. Frost rimmed his lips and eyebrows, yet he showed no signs of shivering, no reaction to the cold that should have killed him already. Varnum stopped the snowmobile and stepped into the man's path. "I need you to stop walking, now." The man walked into him, not aggressive, but inevitable, like a machine that couldn't be diverted. Varnum had to physically grab him to keep him from continuing, and when he did, the man's skin felt wrong. Cold, yes, but with a different quality than just winter cold. This was deeper, older, the kind of cold that came from the bottom of lakes. The man's mouth opened. No breath emerged, No fog in the frigid air. His voice came anyway, flat and without inflection. Have to go back. It's calling. Time to go back down. Back down where? Who are you? Was walking, came out of the water. Have to go back. It's been so long, so cold, so deep. Have to go back. Varnum managed to get him onto the snowmobile, though the man never stopped moving his legs in that walking motion, feet pedaling air. He radioed for an ambulance and medical backup, then drove back to Una's cabin, the man sitting behind him still making those walking motions, still whispering about going back, about the deep, about the calling. At the cabin, with Una's help, they got the man inside near her wood stove. The heat seemed to bring him slightly back to awareness. His eyes focused somewhat, though they still had that looking-through quality. Una wrapped him in blankets while Varnum tried to get information. "What's your name? Where did you come from?" The man's teeth chattered now, which Varnum took as a good sign, meant his body was starting to react normally to temperature. Thomas, I was fishing, winter fishing, 5 years ago. Or 15, I don't... How long has it been? I went through the ice. The current took me down into the trench. I couldn't get back to the hole, I couldn't find the light. I drowned in the dark. Varnum and Una exchanged looks. The man's words were impossible, but his certainty was absolute. "Thomas, you're alive. You're right here. You didn't drown." "I did, I remember. The water was so cold, and then it wasn't cold anymore. It was just dark and quiet, and something was down there. In the deepest part. It was waiting. Others were there too, all of us who went through the ice over the years, all of us who drowned in that trench. It keeps us there. But now it's sending us back, one at a time, walking us back out the way we came in." The ambulance arrived, and the EMTs took Thomas, who had started seizing. His core temperature was 83 degrees, severe hypothermia, but somehow he'd walked across a mile of frozen lake. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed Varnum's arm with surprising strength. "Check the lake records. Check how many people drowned in that trench. We're all still down there, all of us, and it's sending us back now one by one, walking us back out. But we can't stay up here. We have to go back down. It's the only place we belong now." Varnum spent the next day pulling records. Over 50 years, 17 people had drowned in Lake Kabetogama, 8 of them in the deep trench area. 7 of those bodies were never recovered, pulled down by the current into the darkest depths. Thomas Riley was one of them, missing for 12 years after falling through the ice during a solo fishing trip. Presumed dead, memorial held, estate settled. The dive team arrived the next morning, but before they could enter the water, another call came in. A woman walking on the ice, same area, same pattern. They intercepted her before she reached the hole. She identified herself as Claire Morrison, drowned in 1998. After that, they came more frequently. Every few days, another one emerging from the lake, walking that same straight line toward the center, toward the hole. All of them missing from drowning incidents. All of them with that gray, waxy skin and the cold that went deeper than winter. The dive team finally went down. 3 experienced divers with thermal gear and enough lights to turn the underwater trench into daylight. They descended along the line of footprints Varnum had seen through the ice hole, prints that continued down the underwater slope into the trench. The divers reported seeing them clearly even in the depths, pressed into the silt bottom, leading down into darkness their lights couldn't fully penetrate. At 180 feet, at the edge of their safe diving range, they found what they radioed up as an anomaly, a structure or formation on the trench floor, roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across. It wasn't rock and wasn't anything they recognized. The surface seemed to have texture, almost organic, and it was warmer than the surrounding water. Their instruments registered it at 68 degrees. Around it, scattered in a wide pattern, were personal effects. Fishing equipment, tackle boxes, a wallet, boots. The debris field of decades of drownings. And bodies. 7 of them, or what remained of them, preserved impossibly in the cold water but arranged in a circle around the anomaly, all facing inward. The dive team surfaced quickly after that, one of them shaking so badly it took an hour for him to stop. They refused to go back down. Nothing could compel them. Whatever was at the bottom of that trench, they said, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't finished with the people it had taken. Thomas Riley died in the hospital 3 days after being found. The official cause was listed as complications from hypothermia, but the attending physician told Varnum off the record that Thomas's body had been shutting down in a way he'd never seen, as if it had been preserved somehow and only started dying once removed from the preserving medium. Claire Morrison lasted longer, nearly a week, but the result was the same. And others kept coming, walking out of the lake, walking that straight line toward the center, toward the hole, trying to return to the deep. Varnum worked with the state to mark the area as extremely dangerous and seal the access points, but you can't really seal a frozen lake. The tracks kept appearing in winter, sometimes visible from shore. The hole in the center never froze over completely, no matter how cold it got, maintaining that perfect circle with the warm frost around its edges. Fishermen reported seeing the tracks and learned to avoid following them. The old-timers nodded knowingly and said they'd always known there was something wrong with that part of the lake, something that had been there long before humans came to fish and boat and drown in its waters. Varnum retired 2 years ago, but he still lives near Kabetogama. On winter nights when the ice sings, when temperature and pressure combine to make the frozen surface crack and groan with sounds like distant voices, he sometimes drives down to the shore. With binoculars, he watches the ice, looking for that single line of footprints appearing out of nowhere, heading toward the center. He's seen them twice since retiring. Once, the line of prints. Another time, a figure walking, steady and inevitable, heading toward the deep water. He never calls it in anymore. What would be the point? They can't stop them, can't save them. They're already dead, have been for years. They're just trying to go home, back to whatever is waiting in the trench, whatever kept them preserved and now occasionally sends them back up to walk across the ice before calling them back down again. Varnum has theories about what might be down there, about old things that existed in these lakes long before humans named them and claimed them. Things that take what falls into their domain and keep it, reshaping it, owning it in ways that don't end with death. But theories don't matter much. What matters is the hole never freezes, the tracks keep appearing, and every winter 1 or 2 of the long drowned try to complete their final journey back into the deep. The boundary waters are vast, thousands of lakes connected by rivers and streams and underground channels. How many others have something waiting in their depths? How many other drowning victims are being kept and collected and occasionally sent back up to walk the ice? Varnum doesn't know, and he's not sure he wants to find out. Some questions don't have answers you can live with. Some mysteries are better left frozen at the bottom of dark water, where the cold goes so deep it becomes something else entirely, something that keeps and calls and never truly lets go. Sheriff Rufus Daring had spent 32 years in law enforcement in Minnesota's driftless region, where the landscape refused to flatten the way the rest of the state did, where bluffs and valleys created pockets of isolation that could hide a house from its nearest neighbor by miles of winding road. At 58, Daring knew every farm and homestead in his jurisdiction, could remember which families had lived where going back 3 generations. The old Kellerman place had been abandoned for 7 years now, ever since the family moved away after what they called troubles, but wouldn't specify further. The call came in on a Thursday evening in October. Librarian Tilda Ravenshaw, who lived closest to the Kellerman property, reported seeing lights in the farmhouse windows. She'd been driving home from town when she noticed them, yellow and warm, as if someone had lit every lamp in the house at once. The property had been empty for years. Electricity turned off, no one with any reason to be there. Daring told her he'd check it out, expecting squatters or maybe teenagers looking for a place to party away from adult eyes. He drove out as the sun was setting, the October air carrying that particular smell of fallen leaves and approaching winter. The Kellerman farm sat at the end of a dirt road that wound between bluffs, the house barely visible until you were almost on top of it. A 2-story farmhouse that had been built in the 1920s. White paint, now gray and peeling. A barn listing to one side behind it. As Daring approached, he saw what Tilda had reported. Every window glowed with light, warm and inviting despite the property's obvious abandonment. He parked in the driveway, noting that no other vehicles were present. The front porch sagged under his weight as he climbed the steps, and when he tried the door, it swung open easily. Inside, the house was furnished, dust-covered but intact. The Kellerman family had left most of their belongings, as if they'd fled in a hurry and never came back for their things. But there were no lights on. Every room Daring checked was dark, lit only by his flashlight beam and the dying daylight from the windows. He stood in the front hallway, confused. From outside, the house had been blazing with light. From inside, there was nothing. He went back out to the porch and looked at the windows. Dark. Every one of them. He got in his cruiser, backed down the driveway about 50 yards, and looked again. The house was lit up like Christmas, every window bright. He drove back, went inside. Darkness. This happened 3 more times before Daring radioed for backup, his voice tight. "This is making no sense. Something's not right with this property." Deputy Ephra Doolin arrived 20 minutes later, and Daring walked him through what he'd observed. Doolin saw it too, the impossible lights that appeared from a distance but vanished up close. They decided to search the house thoroughly, looking for any rational explanation. Generators, battery-powered lights, anything. In the basement, behind the old furnace, they found something that changed the investigation entirely. A cardboard box sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. Inside were cassette tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with dates spanning from 1907 to 93. Next to the box sat an old cassette player, battery compartment corroded but otherwise intact. Daring picked up the first tape, labeled March 15th, 1907, call and a 1, and brought everything upstairs to the kitchen where he could examine it in better light. They found batteries in a drawer that still held some charge, and Daring loaded the first tape. Static for a few seconds, then a voice emerged, official and familiar. "Sheriff's Department, what's your emergency?" It was Daring's own voice, but younger, from decades ago. A woman's voice answered, frightened. "There's someone in my house. I can hear them upstairs. Please, I'm alone with my children." Daring remembered this call. Mrs. Kellerman reporting an intruder. He'd responded himself, searched the house, found nothing. The tape continued, playing out exactly as he remembered it. His arrival, the search, his assurances to Mrs. Kellerman that no one was in the house. Then the tape ended with a click. He loaded the second tape. Same date, different timestamp. "Sheriff's Department. What's your emergency?" His voice again. Mrs. Kellerman again, same words. "There's someone in my house. I can hear them upstairs." But this time, subtle differences emerged as the recording played. Daring heard himself searching the house, but in this version he found a window open that he didn't remember being open. His younger voice confused. "Ma'am, did you leave this upstairs window open?" Mrs. Kellerman, certain. "No, I never opened that window. It's painted shut." Tape 3. Same basic call, but different details. A door left ajar, footprints in the dust upstairs. Each recording was a variation on the same incident. Small differences accumulating. By tape 7, the voice on the phone wasn't Mrs. Kellerman anymore. It was Daring himself, calling in from the house. "I need backup at the Kellerman farm. I've got something here I can't explain. There are people in this house, but they're not quite right. They're doing the same things over and over." That version of the recording ended with the sounds Daring couldn't identify. Movement, voices overlapping, his own voice saying something he never remembered saying. "It's showing me what could have happened. What might still happen. It's not done with this place. It's still calling." Doolin had gone pale. "Sheriff? What the hell is this?" Daring had no answer. He loaded more tapes, and the recordings grew stranger. Conversations that never happened, but could have happened. Investigations into incidents at the house that sounded almost right but were skewed, wrong in ways that made them feel like fever dreams. One tape featured an interview with Mr. Kellerman, talking about how the house had always felt watched, how events seemed to repeat with slight variations, how he'd wake up sometimes convinced he'd lived the same day twice, but with different outcomes. "It's like the house is trying different versions," Mr. Kellerman's voice said on the tape. "Same events, same people, but the details shift. Sometimes I find things in different places. Sometimes my daughter has a conversation I swear happened yesterday, but she has no memory of it. The house is showing us possibilities, or maybe it's showing us what it wants to happen. We need to leave before it decides which version is real." The tapes went on, documenting 6 years of variations on the same incidents. Calls about intruders, searches that found nothing, or searches that found something. Mr. Kellerman's voice appearing sometimes as a caller, sometimes as a victim, sometimes as something else. His words slurred and strange as if he were speaking from somewhere far away, or from some time that hadn't happened yet. The final tape was labeled November 3rd, 1993. Final recording. Daring loaded it with hands that shook slightly. Static, then his own voice, but older than it should have been for 1993. "This is Sheriff Daring making a final report on the Kellerman property. After 6 years of investigating anomalous incidents, I'm recommending the house be condemned and demolished. Something in or around this structure is generating temporal inconsistencies. Events replay with variations. Multiple versions of the same incidents appear to exist simultaneously. The family has evacuated. The house should not be entered again." Then another voice, also Daring's, but different somehow, overlapping with the first. "The house isn't generating anything. It's recording. It's collecting every possibility, every version of events that could happen here. It's building a library of potentials, and now it's starting to play them back. We need to seal this property immediately. If these recordings start manifesting physically..." The tape cut off abruptly. Daring and Doolin sat in the kitchen in silence, the only sound the wind moving through cracks in the old house's walls. Daring had no memory of making that recording. The case had never been officially documented beyond standard incident reports. Yet here was his voice, describing events he didn't remember but that felt disturbingly plausible, like memories from a dream that faded upon waking. They searched the rest of the house and found more tapes in other locations. Some hidden, some in plain sight on shelves and in closets. Each one documented variations on incidents at the farmhouse. Calls about strange noises, about intruders, about family members behaving oddly, about the house itself seeming to shift and change when no one was looking. Some tapes featured voices of people Daring knew were alive. Others had voices of people he knew had died years ago. All of them described the house as if it were a living thing, collecting and playing back realities like a massive recording device. In the master bedroom closet, they found a journal kept by Mrs. Kellerman. The final entry sent ice through Daring's veins. November 2nd, 1993. We're leaving tomorrow. I can't stay in this house anymore. Every day I wake up and something is slightly different. A picture moved, a conversation with my husband that he swears never happened. Yesterday I found a cassette tape with my own voice on it, calling the sheriff. But I never made that call. The tape documented a version of events that almost happened but didn't. How many versions are there? How many times have we lived these same days with slightly different outcomes? The house is choosing which reality to keep. I can feel it deciding. We have to leave before it decides we should have died in one of the other versions. Daring and Doolin left the house as full dark settled over the bluffs. From the road, they watched the windows, still dark. Then, as they drove away and looked back, all the lights blazed on simultaneously. Not electric lights, Daring realized, but something else. The glow of events happening, possibilities playing out, versions of reality stacked on top of each other in that old farmhouse. The house showing them what could be, what might be, what almost was. Over the following weeks, Daring investigated quietly, not filing official reports. He learned that Tilda Ravenshaw wasn't the first to report lights in the abandoned farmhouse. Neighbors had seen them on and off for years, but rarely called it in, assuming someone had bought the property. When Daring tracked down the Kellerman family, living now in Iowa, Mrs. Kellerman was reluctant to discuss the house. "We don't talk about that place," she said over the phone. "What happened there, what we experienced, people would think we'd lost our minds. But I'll tell you this, that house is still recording, still collecting versions of events. If you've been inside it, you might be in its collection now. Different versions of you, making different choices, investigating different outcomes. Be careful, Sheriff. The house decides which version becomes real, and it doesn't always choose the one where everyone survives." Daring had the property officially condemned, but demolition kept getting delayed. Equipment failures, contractor cancellations, budget issues. The house remained standing, windows dark during the day, but neighbors continued reporting lights at night. Sometimes they saw figures moving inside, shadows that looked like the Kellerman family. Sometimes they saw Daring himself, or versions of him, searching the house over and over again, finding different evidence each time. 3 months after his initial visit, Daring was going through his case files and found something that stopped his heart. A report he'd filed in '93 about the Kellerman property, recommending demolition due to structural instability and unusual electromagnetic readings. The report was in his handwriting, signed by him, but he had no memory of writing it. At the bottom, a note in his own hand. "Do not enter this property again. The recordings are becoming physical. Multiple versions of events are occurring simultaneously. The house is choosing which to make permanent." He checked the archives and found more documents he didn't remember creating. Incident reports, investigation notes, recommendations for specialists to examine the property. All in his handwriting, all signed, all describing events that sounded right, but sat in his memory like dreams. As if they'd happened to a version of him that existed in one of the house's recordings, a version that had made different choices, investigated differently, discovered things that this version of Daring had missed or forgotten. Tilda Ravenshaw called again 6 months later. The lights were back, but this time she'd heard something else, radio chatter, like police communications coming from inside the house. She'd parked on the road and listened, and it was Daring's voice calling for backup, describing a scene at the Kellerman farm. Multiple casualties, family deceased, evidence of timeline corruption, requesting immediate containment. Then other voices, some she recognized from the sheriff's department, some she didn't, all describing different versions of what was happening at the property, all talking over each other, all urgent and frightened. Daring didn't go back to the house. He knew, somehow, that if he did, he might find himself in one of those recordings, might step into a version of events where the outcome was different from the one he'd lived. The house was still playing its tapes, still showing all the possibilities, all the variations on what had happened, and what could happen and what might still happen. And somewhere in that collection of recorded realities, there were versions where he'd made different choices, where the investigations had gone differently, where outcomes had been fatal. The house still stands. Windows dark in daylight, glowing at night with the light of recorded possibilities. Neighbors hear voices sometimes, police radios, calls for help, the same incidents playing out with endless variations. The Kellerman farm has become a place people avoid, not officially haunted, but wrong in ways that are harder to explain than simple ghosts. It's a place where reality recorded itself too many times, where the same events played out in different versions until the house became a library of potentials, all of them equally real, all of them waiting to be chosen as the final, permanent outcome. Daring retired last year. He moved to Wisconsin across the state line, as far from the driftless bluffs as he could manage while staying close enough to visit family. But sometimes, late at night, his phone rings, and when he answers, he hears his own voice calling from the Kellerman farm, requesting backup, describing impossible scenes, reporting outcomes that never happened but could have. Each time, the details are slightly different. Each time, the version of himself on the phone sounds more desperate, more certain that this time, this version, will be the one the house chooses to make real. And each time Daring hangs up, he wonders if he's the real version or just another recording, another possibility in the collection, waiting to be played back when the house decides which Sheriff Daring gets to be permanent. Sheriff Hiram Coakley had worked the Red River Valley for 28 years, and he knew winter up here could kill you in ways people from warmer places couldn't comprehend. At 54, he'd seen whiteouts that erased the world, temperatures that dropped to 40 below, and drifts that buried entire vehicles in minutes. The valley stretched flat and endless along the Minnesota-North Dakota border, farmland interrupted only by the occasional town or tree line, the kind of landscape where you could see weather coming from miles away but couldn't necessarily escape it. The blizzard warning came through on a February afternoon, one of those prairie storms that meteorologists tracked with genuine concern. County Road 7 needed one final patrol before they shut it down, making sure no one was stranded out there when the storm hit with full force. Coakley took the run himself, letting his deputies handle the closer-in areas. He knew the road, had driven it thousands of times. 30 miles of straight asphalt, cutting through frozen fields, 2 farmhouses, 1 abandoned gas station. Nothing that should pose any problems. He was 15 miles in when the snow started. Light at first, but quickly building to the kind of fall that reduced visibility to a few car lengths. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch, other roads already closing, drifts forming faster than the plows could clear them. The wind picked up, shaking his cruiser, driving the snow horizontal across his headlight beams. This was the kind of storm that changed geography, that made familiar roads strange and filled culverts with drifts tall as a man. Coakley was preparing to turn back when his headlights caught a road sign he didn't recognize. County Road 7B, with an arrow pointing left. He slowed, confused. There was no 7B. He'd driven this stretch countless times, and the only intersections were clearly marked on his mental map of the area. But there was the sign, green and white and official-looking, indicating a turnoff he was certain didn't exist. He radioed dispatch. "I'm at mile marker 15 on County Road 7. There's a sign here for 7B. That road's not on any map, is it?" Static filled the response, words breaking up. "Can't, maps, back to..." Then nothing but white noise. The blizzard was interfering with communications, which happened but never failed to make Coakley feel isolated in a way that went beyond simple distance. He should have kept going straight, should have trusted his knowledge of the territory. But something about the sign bothered him. It looked new, the paint fresh, as if it had been installed recently, and there were tracks in the snow, tire tracks turning onto this road that shouldn't exist, recent enough that the storm hadn't completely filled them in. Someone had come this way within the last hour. Coakley turned left, following the tracks. The road was paved, maintained, completely real despite his certainty it shouldn't be here. Fields stretched away on both sides, indistinguishable in the blowing snow. The tracks ahead of him were clear enough to follow, two distinct wheel paths leading into the white darkness. After a mile, maybe two, distance was hard to judge in these conditions. His headlights caught something that made him brake. A vehicle in the ditch, angled nose down, snow already beginning to drift against its sides. He called it in, or tried to. The radio gave him nothing but static. His cell phone showed no signal. He was on his own, which meant getting out into wind that hit him like a physical force, cold that burned his lungs despite the scarf across his face. The vehicle was a state-owned SUV, and when Coakley brushed snow off the driver's window, he saw someone inside. A man, slumped over the wheel, state investigator credentials visible on his jacket. The door was unlocked. Coakley checked for a pulse and found one, steady but slow. The man's skin was cold, hypothermic but not yet critical. Coakley shook him gently. "Sir, can you hear me?" "State investigator, I need you to wake up." The man's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening with confusion and something that looked like fear. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse. "I was driving to Grand Forks. I saw the sign for 7B and thought it was a shortcut, but I've been driving for hours. This road doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps going straight, same fields, same nothing, and then I started seeing the signs." "What signs?" "Warning signs, wrong way, do not enter, turn back." But I couldn't turn back because there was nowhere to turn. The road behind me was gone every time I looked in the mirror, like it was erasing itself. So I kept going forward until I ran off the road here. He focused on Coakley more clearly. "You're a sheriff. You came down 7B to get here?" I turned onto it from County Road 7, about 3 miles back. The man, whose credentials identified him as State Investigator Lorcan Whitby, shook his head slowly. "I've been on this road for 3 hours. I've driven at least 50 miles. There's no way you're 3 miles from anything." Coakley helped Whitby into the cruiser, cranking the heat. The man was shivering hard now, a good sign that his body was trying to warm itself. Coakley's instinct was to turn around and head back the way he'd come. But when he looked behind them, the road disappeared into the blowing snow, no tracks visible, not even his own from minutes ago. The storm was erasing everything, or something else was. He drove forward slowly, following what he thought was the road, though the pavement edges were increasingly hard to distinguish from the fields. Whitby huddled in the passenger seat, rubbing his hands together. "There's something wrong with this road. I passed the same fence post 5 times. I'm certain it was the same one. Same distinctive lean, same spacing from the road. Like I was looping, but the road felt straight." "Roads don't loop in the Red River Valley," Coakley said. But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. He'd seen strange things in whiteouts before, optical illusions, snow blindness, but this felt different. The road under his tires felt wrong, as if he were driving on something that approximated pavement but wasn't quite right. The surface was too smooth, too consistent, no cracks or patches, or the familiar feel of County Road 7B that still shouldn't exist. After what his odometer said was 5 miles but felt like 20, they reached another sign. This one stopped Coakley cold. County Road 7B ends, no services ahead. Beyond it, the road did appear to end, simply terminating in what looked like an open field. But as his headlights swept across the snow, he saw something else. A building, squat and dark, maybe 100 yards off what used to be the road. Light glowed in one window, warm and inviting against the storm. Whitby saw it too. "We should check if there's a phone, maybe someone who can call for help." They approached the building on foot, the wind trying to push them off course. It was an old farmhouse, or had been once. Now it looked half abandoned, siding weathered and peeling, but that single window glowed with steady light. Coakley knocked, the sound immediately swallowed by the wind. The door opened before he could knock again. The woman who answered was maybe 70, wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. She smiled as if she'd been expecting them. Come in. Terrible night to be out. I'm Avis Penhaligon. I was just making coffee." Her voice was pleasant, grandmotherly, but something in her eyes made Coakley's hand drift toward his weapon. The inside of the house was warm, furnished with antiques, everything neat and orderly. An old wood stove radiated heat. The smell of coffee filled the air. It all seemed normal except for the way Avis watched them, as if measuring their reactions, as if this were some kind of test. "You're on 7B, she said, not quite a question. "A lot of people end up on 7B when storms come through. It's a strange road, always has been." "Ma'am, there is no County Road 7B, Coakley said. "It doesn't exist on any map." "Oh, it exists," Avis said, pouring coffee into mugs that looked hand-painted. "It's just not always in the same place. The valley, you see, it's not as simple as it looks. Flat and empty, sure, but there are old roots underneath. Paths that existed before we paved anything. Before we drew maps and claimed we knew where everything was. Sometimes in storms, those old roots come back, and sometimes people find them." Whitby accepted the coffee, but didn't drink. "How long have you lived here?" "Oh, I don't live here exactly," Avis said, settling into a rocking chair. "I work here. I'm what you might call a guide. When people get lost on 7B, I help them find their way back, or forward. Depends on which way they need to go." Coakley's radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice breaking through the static. "All units. Blizzard conditions critical. County Road 7 closed. If anyone is, respond." The transmission cut off, but it had been real. Proof that somewhere outside this strange detour, the normal world continued. "You need to go back to where you entered 7B, Avis said, her tone gentle but firm. "The road opens when storms come, but it closes again when they pass. If you're still on it when the storm ends, well, you'll be stuck here until another storm opens the way. Could be weeks, could be months. Time works different on 7B. "How do we get back?" Coakley asked, though part of him wanted to argue, to insist this was all some storm-induced hallucination. But the house was real, the woman was real, and the wrongness of the road was undeniable. "Follow the lights," Avis said, pointing toward the window. Outside, in the swirling snow, Coakley could see lights now. Not electric lights, but something else. flickering and blue, arranged in a line leading back the way they'd come. Those will guide you to the exit, but you need to go now. The storm's almost peaked, and when it does, the road decides whether to keep you or let you go. They left without finishing the coffee, without asking more questions that probably had no answers Coakley could accept. The lights were visible even in the blizzard, hanging in the air like lanterns or markers, spaced about 50 yards apart and leading into the white darkness. Coakley drove slowly, following them, Whitby silent beside him. The lights led them for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Time stretched and compressed oddly on this road. Eventually, Coakley recognized something. A fence line he knew from County Road 7. The lights flickered once and vanished. His headlights illuminated familiar pavement, the intersection where 7B shouldn't be. The sign was gone. Behind them, only the storm and empty fields. Whitby turned to look back. Did that actually happen? Coakley didn't answer immediately. He drove back towards a town, his radio suddenly working again. Dispatch confirming the storm was worsening and all roads were officially closed. When they reached the station, Whitby looked at him. "I'm going to file a report. Strange occurrence, possible disorientation due to weather conditions. That's the truth, isn't it? We got disoriented?" "That's one truth," Coakley said. He filed his own report in similar terms. Nothing about impossible roads or guides named Avis or lights that floated in the storm. But he pulled maps that night, old maps going back to the 1800s, before the valley was fully surveyed and settled. And he found it. County Road 7B, or something like it, marked on an 1887 map as Old River Crossing, unreliable route, use caution. The road followed a path that native tribes had used, and before them, something else. An ancient route that predated human settlement, a way through the valley that existed in some deeper geography than modern maps acknowledged. Over the years, Coakley heard other stories. Drivers who claimed to have turned onto roads that vanished after the storm. A trucker who swore he'd driven for hours on a highway that led nowhere and then suddenly found himself back on Interstate 29 with no memory of how he got there. An EMT named Avis Penhaligon, though when Coakley checked, the records showed an Avis Penhaligon who'd worked emergency services in the valley in the 1960s, died in 1973, body never recovered after responding to a call during a massive blizzard. Whitby was transferred to another district 6 months later. Never spoke about the incident again, according to mutual colleagues. But he sent Coakley a package before he left. Inside was an old photograph, black and white, dated 1952. It showed a farmhouse in the snow, and standing in the doorway was a woman who looked exactly like the Avis they'd met. On the back, handwritten, "Storm shelter on Old River Crossing Road. Woman identified as Avis Penhaligon, local volunteer. Photo taken the day before she disappeared." Coakley keeps the photograph in his desk drawer. He's been sheriff through 3 more major blizzards since that February night, and each time he gets reports. Drivers seeing signs for roads that don't exist. Vehicles found abandoned on stretches of highway that seem wrong somehow, too long or too straight, or leading to places that can't be reached by those routes. The valley keeps its secrets, and in winter storms, those secrets sometimes surface. Old paths opening up, guides appearing to help or hinder, time and space bending around routes that remember being important long before anyone thought to pave them. Sometimes during blizzards, Coakley drives out to County Road 7, parks at mile marker 15, and watches. He's never seen the sign for 7B appear again, never had reason to turn down that impossible road. But he sees the lights sometimes, far out in the fields, blue and flickering, arranged in patterns that suggest paths leading to somewhere else. Other deputies have reported them too, though no one talks about it officially. In the Red River Valley, where the land is flat and the storms can erase everything familiar, there are roots that exist between the world we map and the world that was here first. And in the worst storms, those roots open. Whether they lead somewhere better or somewhere you can never return from, Coakley can't say. But he knows the guides are real, and he knows the valley remembers its old paths. And sometimes, when the snow falls hard enough and the wind blows cold enough, those paths call out to travelers, offering shortcuts that might save you or might lead you somewhere time flows differently and storms never end. The road sign for County Road 7B has never appeared on any official map or survey since that night. But Coakley has a file in his locked cabinet marked Weather-Related Anomalies, and it contains dozens of reports from drivers who swear they've seen it. A green and white sign pointing to a road that shouldn't exist, appearing when storms hit hardest. Some people follow it. Most don't come back the same night. Some don't come back at all. And those who do return usually can't explain exactly where they went. Just that they drove for hours on a road that felt wrong, through a storm that never ended, until lights appeared and guided them back to familiar territory. Back to the world that exists on maps, leaving behind the older world that exists in the spaces between storms and memory, where guides wait in farmhouses that may or may not be there when the snow clears, where coffee is always hot and warnings are given kindly, and where the valley keeps count of everyone who travels its secret roads. Sheriff Marcus Brennan had worked the northernmost county in Minnesota for 26 years, a stretch of wilderness so remote that some of the logging roads didn't appear on any map, and the nearest hospital was 90 miles away. At 52, Brennan had seen his share of strange things in these woods: bears walking upright in the distance, lights that moved between the trees with no source, sounds that didn't match any animal he could name. The old-timers said the forest remembered things, events and people and tragedies that had soaked into the soil and never quite left. Brennan had learned not to dismiss those stories entirely, not after what happened in the fall of 2016. The missing person report came in on a Wednesday morning in late September. A graduate student from the University of Minnesota named Sarah Chen had failed to check in from her research site for 3 consecutive days. She'd been conducting a study on old-growth forest ecology, camping alone in a section of state forest that hadn't been logged in over a century. Her advisor had grown concerned when Sarah's daily data uploads stopped, and her satellite phone went straight to voicemail. Brennan organized a search team, though the territory was challenging. Sarah's research site was accessible only by a combination of logging roads and hiking trails, a good 12 miles from the nearest maintained road. The forest in that area was dense, with trees that had been growing for 200 years creating a canopy so thick that even at noon, the light barely reached the ground. Cell phone coverage was non-existent, and the terrain was broken by ravines and seasonal creeks that could shift course after heavy rain. They found Sarah's camp on the second day of searching. Her tent was still standing, zipped closed from the inside. Her research equipment was laid out neatly on a folding table, notebooks filled with data, camera equipment, specimens labeled and stored. The campfire pit showed signs of recent use, and food was properly stored in a bear-proof container hanging from a tree. Everything suggested Sarah had left camp voluntarily and expected to return, but there was no sign of her, and no indication of which direction she'd gone. Brennan's deputy, a young man named Collins, who'd grown up hunting these woods, noticed something odd about the surrounding trees. "Sheriff, look at these marks." He pointed to scratches on several tree trunks, clustered about 7 feet off the ground. They were fresh, the wood pale where bark had been scraped away. The pattern didn't match bear claws or any other animal marking Brennan recognized. The scratches were evenly spaced, almost methodical, and they appeared on trees in a rough circle around the campsite. The search expanded, teams moving in grid patterns, calling Sarah's name until their voices echoed through the silent forest. They found her backpack on the third day, about a mile from camp, sitting upright against a tree as if someone had carefully placed it there. Inside were Sarah's wallet, her satellite phone with a dead battery, and her journal. The last entry was dated 4 days earlier. Something is watching me. I know how that sounds, but I've felt it for 3 nights now. Not an animal. Animals move, make noise, leave traces. This is different. It's patient. It waits just outside the firelight, and I can feel its attention like weight on my skin. I'm going to set up the trail cameras in a wider pattern tomorrow. I need to know what this is. Brennan examined the journal entry with growing unease. Sarah was a scientist, trained to observe and document. If she said something was watching her, she believed it. He had the team retrieve all of Sarah's trail cameras, memory cards full of footage. That evening, back at the station, he reviewed the recordings with Collins and a wildlife expert from the Department of Natural Resources. Most of the footage showed normal forest activity. Deer moving through at dawn. A black bear investigating Sarah's food storage. Smaller animals going about their nocturnal business. But on the cameras positioned at the perimeter of the camp, there was something else. The footage was difficult to explain, and even the wildlife expert seemed troubled by what they were seeing. On multiple nights, starting about a week before Sarah's disappearance, the cameras captured movement at the edge of their range. Not quite in focus, not clearly visible, but present. A figure, or something that moved like a figure, standing motionless among the trees. It appeared in different locations, always at the periphery, always just beyond clear visibility. What disturbed Brennan most was its behavior. It didn't move like an animal. Animals in camera footage were either passing through or investigating something specific. This remained absolutely still for hours, facing toward the camera, toward the camp, just watching. On the night before Sarah disappeared, multiple cameras captured it closer, though still maddeningly unclear. Tall, perhaps 7 feet, with proportions that seemed almost human but not quite right. The limbs were too long, the posture too rigid. In one frame, its face was partially visible, or what might have been a face, pale, with dark hollows where eyes should be. The wildlife expert reviewed that frame multiple times before shaking his head. I've worked with wildlife cameras for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. It's not a bear standing up. It's not a person in the distance. I don't know what it is. The final footage from Sarah's cameras was from the night she vanished. Multiple angles showed her sitting by her campfire, writing in her journal, occasionally looking up toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Then, around 11 p.m., she stood abruptly, staring into the trees to the north of camp. For several minutes, she remained frozen, her body language suggesting intense focus or fear. Then she walked directly into the forest, leaving the fire burning, leaving everything behind. She moved with purpose, not running, not hesitant. Just walking into the darkness as if drawn by something the cameras couldn't capture. The last clear image showed her at the edge of the firelight, pausing to look back once at her camp. Her expression was difficult to read in the poor light, but Brennan thought it looked like resignation, or perhaps recognition. Then she stepped between the trees and disappeared from view. The cameras continued recording through the night. At approximately 3 a.m., something moved through the camp. Large, moving on 2 legs, methodically examining Sarah's belongings. It never came close enough to the cameras for a clear view, staying just at the edge of proper focus, but Brennan could see it was the same figure from the earlier footage. Searching, perhaps, or claiming territory. After 20 minutes, it retreated into the forest, moving with that same disturbing fluidity that suggested intelligence and purpose. The search continued for 2 weeks, expanding to cover nearly 30 square miles of wilderness. They brought in additional teams, search dogs, and a helicopter with thermal imaging. The dogs lost Sarah's scent about half a mile from camp, at a location where the forest floor showed signs of disturbance. The ground was torn up as if something had struggled there, but there was no blood, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate violence. The scent just stopped, as if Sarah had ceased to exist at that spot. Brennan made the decision to investigate the area more thoroughly. What they found deepened the mystery. Beneath a layer of fallen leaves and debris, they discovered what looked like a den or shelter, carved into the earth between the roots of a massive old tree. It was large enough for a person to crouch inside, the walls packed hard and smooth, as if used regularly. Inside, they found items that made Brennan's blood run cold. Pieces of clothing, old and weathered. A rusted watch, a pair of glasses, a driver's license from 1987, belonging to a man named Robert Hayes who had disappeared while hiking in this same forest nearly 30 years earlier. The den contained other items too, arranged with what seemed like deliberate care. Smooth stones and patterns. Bones, both animal and what forensics would later confirm as human, laid out in geometric designs. And photographs, dozens of them. Old Polaroids and more recent digital prints showing people camping and hiking in these woods. Some of the faces Brennan recognized from missing person cases, disappearances that had been attributed to people getting lost or injured in the vast wilderness. But seeing them here, in this hidden den, suggested something far more disturbing. They hadn't simply gotten lost. Something had been watching them, collecting their images, and eventually taking them. The investigation expanded to include FBI specialists who dealt with unusual cases, and what they uncovered over the following months painted a picture that challenged everything Brennan thought he understood about his territory. Over the past 40 years, 37 people had disappeared in this section of forest. Most cases were officially classified as lost hikers or hunters who had succumbed to the elements. But when the cases were examined together, patterns emerged. All the disappearances occurred between late August and early October. All the victims had been camping or hiking alone. And in the cases where campsites were found, there were often reports of the victim mentioning being watched, feeling uneasy, or experiencing strange encounters in the days before they vanished. Local historians and anthropologists were consulted, and they provided context that made the situation even more unsettling. The native tribes who had inhabited this region for thousands of years before European settlement had stories about the deep forest, about watchers in the trees that claimed people who ventured too far alone. They had names for these beings, different tribes calling them different things, but the descriptions were consistent. Tall, patient, neither animal nor human existing in the spaces between what could be seen and what could be understood. The tribes had avoided certain areas of the forest, marking them as places where the boundary between the human world and something else grew thin. The section of forest where Sarah had disappeared was one of those marked areas. The old maps, when Brennan finally located them in the Historical Society archives, showed it labeled in French, Bois de Surveillance, the Watching Woods. Early fur trappers and loggers had reported similar experiences. People disappearing, others claiming to see figures among the trees that didn't behave like any known animal. By the 1920s, that section of forest had been largely abandoned, left to grow wild while logging operations focused on more accessible areas. 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, with no body recovered and no solid leads, Brennan was forced to classify the case as an unexplained missing person. But he continued investigating on his own time, building a comprehensive file on the Watching Woods and its history of disappearances. He interviewed elderly locals who remembered the old stories, who spoke in quiet voices about family members who'd gone into those woods and never returned, about hunters who came back changed, refusing to speak about what they'd seen, about the understanding that certain places demanded respect and distance. One interview particularly haunted Brennan. An 87-year-old man named Thomas Whitford, whose grandfather had been a logger in the 1890s, showed Brennan a letter written in 1894. The letter described a logging camp that had been set up on the edge of the Watching Woods, and how over the course of 2 weeks, 3 workers had vanished. The remaining loggers refused to continue, claiming they were being studied by something in the forest, something that watched them work during the day and moved through their camp at night. The letter's author wrote, "It stands beyond the firelight and watches us with a patience that is not human. It does not hunt like an animal hunts. It selects, it chooses, it takes what it wants when it wants. We are leaving this place. No amount of timber is worth what dwells in these woods." Brennan began to notice something disturbing in his own experience. After spending extensive time in the Watching Woods during the search for Sarah, after handling items from the den and reviewing hundreds of hours of footage, he felt changed. He would wake at night with the certainty that something was outside his window, watching. He'd be driving the empty roads of his county and catch movement in his peripheral vision. Tall figures standing motionless at the forest edge. His wife noticed his changed behavior, the way he'd pause mid-conversation to listen, the way he'd check the locks on the doors multiple times before bed. 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, Brennan received an envelope with no return address, postmarked from a town 200 miles away. Inside was a photograph, printed on regular copy paper, showing a figure standing among trees. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, but Brennan recognized the location immediately. It was the Watching Woods, near where Sarah's camp had been. The figure in the photo was tall, with those 2 long limbs and rigid posture. And standing next to it, barely visible in the shadow of the trees, was what looked like a person. Too indistinct to identify, but the size and shape suggested Sarah Chen. Brennan traced the postmark and found the photo had been mailed from a small town near the Canadian border. With Collins, he drove up to investigate, finding the post office and questioning the clerk. She remembered the person who'd mailed it, a hiker who'd seemed nervous, rushing. Said he'd taken photos while camping and noticed something in them he thought someone should see. Paid cash, wouldn't leave a name. The hiker had been camping in the Watching Woods, and he'd left the area immediately after developing his photos. Brennan tried to track him down through campground registrations and trail permits, but the man had vanished as thoroughly as Sarah. Whether he'd simply gone home and wanted to forget what he'd photographed, or whether something else had happened, Brennan never determined. The photograph became the centerpiece of Brennan's private investigation. He had it analyzed by forensic experts, who confirmed it hadn't been digitally manipulated. Whatever the image showed, it was genuinely present when the photo was taken. The figure matched the proportions and posture of what appeared in Sarah's trail camera footage, and the person standing beside it, if it was Sarah, appeared to be there voluntarily. Not restrained, not struggling, just standing in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Brennan made one final trip to the Watching Woods, alone, armed with camera equipment and recording devices. He set up a new camp near where Sarah's had been, and he waited. The forest around him was silent in a way that felt wrong. No bird calls, no sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through the high canopy and the creak of old trees. As darkness fell, Brennan maintained a fire and waited. His camera pointed at the surrounding darkness, his recorder running continuously. Around midnight he felt it. That sensation Sarah had described in her journal. the weight of attention, the certainty of being observed. He scanned the darkness beyond his firelight and saw nothing, but the feeling intensified. Something was out there, watching with that patient focus that suggested intelligence and purpose. Brennan spoke aloud, his voice steady despite his fear. "I'm Sheriff Marcus Brennan. I'm investigating the disappearance of Sarah Chen. If you can understand me, if you know where she is, I need to know. I need to bring her home." The silence that followed was profound. Then, at the very edge of his firelight, movement. A figure stepped partially into view, tall and unnaturally still, facing toward him. Brennan's camera was recording, his hand steady on his sidearm, though he had no illusion that it would be useful if this encounter turned hostile. For several minutes, neither moved. The figure remained at the boundary between light and shadow, its features impossible to distinguish clearly, but its attention focused entirely on Brennan. Then it turned, a smooth movement that suggested joints that didn't work quite like human joints, and it walked back into the darkness. Not retreating quickly, not startled by Brennan's presence, just choosing to end the encounter. Brennan stayed by his fire until dawn, recording and watching, but the figure didn't return. As sun filtered through the canopy, he packed his equipment and hiked back to his vehicle, the sense of being watched following him the entire way. The footage from that night showed the figure, briefly and unclearly, but present. Brennan never released it publicly, adding it instead to his private files. He retired from the sheriff's position 8 months later, citing health concerns, though those close to him knew the real reason. The watching woods had taken something from him, not his life but his certainty, his understanding of what was possible in the world he'd sworn to protect. Sarah Chen was never found. Her case remains open, one of 37 unexplained disappearances in that section of forest. The FBI investigation eventually closed with no conclusions, the evidence too strange to fit any conventional explanation, too thin to support any extraordinary one. But Brennan knows, and a few others who've studied the cases know, that something exists in those woods, something that watches and waits and occasionally takes what it wants. Something that's been there longer than the trees, longer than human settlement, existing in the deep places where the forest remembers everything that's ever happened within its shadows. The watching woods remain accessible to the public. There are no official warnings beyond standard wilderness safety guidelines. People still camp there, still hike the trails, most never experiencing anything unusual. But every few years, someone doesn't come back. Someone vanishes without explanation, leaving behind a camp or a vehicle and a mystery that can't be solved. And those who've studied the pattern know that somewhere in those ancient woods, among trees that were old when the first Europeans arrived, something continues its patient observation, watching, waiting, selecting, taking what it chooses when conditions are right, adding to its collection of those who ventured too deep, stayed too long, or caught its attention in ways that could never be predicted or prevented. Brennan lives in a small house on the edge of the county now, far from the watching woods, but not far enough to escape the memories. He keeps his files locked in a safe, documentation of cases that challenge everything he thought he knew about law enforcement and wilderness, and the boundaries of the explainable. Sometimes at night, he still feels that weight of attention, that sense of being observed by something patient and unknowable. He'll look out his window at the tree line beyond his property and wonder if something looks back. If the watching woods can extend their reach beyond their physical boundaries, claiming the attention of those who've spent too much time trying to understand them. He doesn't go into the forest anymore. Not even the safe, maintained sections where families picnic and hikers follow marked trails. Once you've felt the full weight of something ancient and intelligent watching you from the darkness, Once you've understood that humans aren't the only conscious things in these wild places, every shadow becomes suspect. Every silent stretch of trees becomes a boundary you're unwilling to cross. The photograph Brennan received still sits in his files. The image of Sarah Chen standing beside something that shouldn't exist. He looks at it sometimes, searching for signs of distress or coercion in her distant figure. But every time he sees the same thing. Someone standing calmly, voluntarily, in the presence of something that watched and waited and finally called. Whether she went willingly in the end, whether whatever exists in those woods offered something that made leaving worth it, or whether her final moments were something darker, Brennan will never know. All he knows is that the watching woods keep their secrets, and they keep their people, and no amount of investigation or understanding will change that fundamental truth. Some places exist outside human authority, outside human comprehension, and all the badges and laws and determined searches in the world can't penetrate mysteries that have roots deeper than civilization itself. The forest remembers. It keeps count. And when you go deep enough into its oldest sections, when you camp alone in places that carry weight in history, you might find yourself being counted too. Being observed, measured, selected. The watching woods have stood for thousands of years, and they'll stand for thousands more, patient and eternal, waiting for the next person who ventures too far into their depths and catches the attention of whatever dwells in the spaces between the trees, where human understanding falters and something older, stranger, and infinitely patient continues its unknowable purpose. Sheriff Anna Holstead had worked law enforcement in northern Minnesota for 19 years, the last 11 as county sheriff, and she thought she understood winter, the kind of cold that turned your breath to ice in the air. The isolation of communities cut off by snow, the way darkness came at 4 in the afternoon and didn't leave until 8 the next morning. At 43, Holstead had responded to countless winter emergencies, pulled vehicles from ditches, checked on elderly residents during storms, coordinated rescues when hikers underestimated the season's brutality. She thought she'd seen every variation of what winter could do to people. Then came the calls about the February house. The first report came in on a Monday morning, the kind of bitter cold day when the temperature started at -20 and the wind chill pushed it to -40. A woman named Patricia Simmons called to report that she'd driven past an abandoned farmhouse on County Road 14, and the place had been lit up like someone was living there. This was unusual because Patricia knew the house well. She'd grown up on the neighboring property, and the farmhouse had been empty for at least 15 years. The owner had died with no heirs, and the property had eventually reverted to the county after years of unpaid taxes. It sat vacant, slowly deteriorating, a 2-story structure with boarded windows and a collapsing front porch. Holstead drove out that afternoon to investigate, bringing Deputy Sarah Walsh with her. The farmhouse looked exactly as it should, abandoned and derelict. The windows were dark, some broken, others covered with plywood that had weathered to gray. The front door hung at an angle, half off its hinges. Snow had drifted against the foundation, and icicles hung from the eaves like teeth. There were no footprints in the snow, no tire tracks, no indication anyone had been near the property in weeks. Holstead and Walsh circled the house, checking all the entrances. Everything was as abandoned as it appeared from the road. Maybe she saw a reflection off the snow, Walsh suggested, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. The sun had been setting when Patricia drove past, and conditions could create optical illusions in winter light. Holstead agreed, filing it as a case of mistaken observation, and they left the property. The second call came 3 days later, this time from an elderly farmer named Douglas Kern, who lived on the opposite side of County Road 14, from the abandoned farmhouse. He'd gotten up around 3 in the morning to check on a calving cow, and when he glanced out his window toward the road, the farmhouse was blazing with light. Not just a few windows, but every single one, bright enough that he could see the structure clearly despite the darkness and the distance. He watched it for nearly 20 minutes while tending his cow, and the lights never wavered. By the time he finished with his livestock and looked again, around 4 a.m., the house was dark. This time, Halstead went alone, arriving at the property just before dawn. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and the house stood in pristine white isolation, clearly unvisited. She approached on foot, her flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, and entered through the broken front door. Inside, the house was as abandoned as ever. Furniture remained, covered in dust and mouse droppings. The walls showed water damage and peeling wallpaper. The stairs to the second floor looked unsafe, several steps broken or missing. There was no electricity. The service had been disconnected years ago. No generator, no battery-powered lights, nothing that could account for the brightness Douglas had described. But as Halstead moved through the ground floor, she noticed something that made her pause. In the dust on the floor, there were marks, not footprints exactly, but disturbances in the thick layer of debris, as if furniture had been moved recently. A table in the kitchen sat at a slightly different angle than she remembered from her previous visit, and when she checked her phone photos from that earlier inspection, the difference was clear. Someone or something had been in the house. Yet there were no prints in the snow outside, no signs of entry beyond the already broken door. Over the following week, 6 more people called to report lights in the farmhouse. All of them saw it after dark, usually in the early morning hours between 2 and 4 a.m. All described the same thing. Every window blazing with warm yellow light, the kind that came from old incandescent bulbs or oil lamps. Some callers mentioned seeing shadows moving past the windows, as if people were walking through the rooms. But every time Halstead investigated, the house was dark and empty. She began to time her visits differently, showing up at 3 a.m., parking down the road and walking in quietly, trying to catch whoever or whatever was creating this phenomenon. She never saw the lights herself, and her sudden arrivals never revealed any occupants. The case took a stranger turn when Halstead decided to stake out the property overnight. She parked her cruiser about a quarter-mile away, in the driveway of a vacant summer cabin, and watched the farmhouse through binoculars. Deputy Walsh volunteered to join her, bringing thermoses of coffee and enough warm gear to survive the -30 temperature. They settled in as darkness fell, the farmhouse a black shape against the snow-covered fields. At 2:47 a.m. by Halstead's dashboard clock, it happened. One moment the house was dark. The next, every window glowed with light. Not gradually, as if someone were going room to room turning on lamps, but all at once. Simultaneous illumination that transformed the derelict structure into something that looked warm and inhabited. Through the binoculars, Halstead could see clearly into the windows. Furnished rooms that looked lived in and well-maintained, nothing like the abandoned interior she'd inspected multiple times. She saw movement, too, shadows passing by the windows, but the distance was too great to make out details. "We've got it," Walsh breathed, already reaching for the radio. Halstead stopped her. "Wait, watch." They observed for 10 minutes, the lights steady, the shadows moving in patterns that suggested normal household activity. Then Halstead made her decision. "We're going in. Stay together. Weapons ready. I don't know what we're dealing with, but it's not breaking and entering by any normal definition." They drove directly to the house, covering the distance in less than 3 minutes. As they approached, the lights were still visible, every window bright. But the moment Halstead's boots hit the snow in front of the property, the lights went out. All of them, simultaneously, leaving the house dark and silent. She and Walsh approached with flashlights drawn, calling out standard announcements. "Sheriff's Department, this property is condemned. Anyone inside needs to exit immediately." Inside, the house was exactly as Holstead had seen it before. Abandoned, dusty, furniture minimal and damaged. No lights, no people, no signs of recent occupation. But the air felt different. Warmer than it should be, given the house had no heat source and the outside temperature was deadly cold. And there was a smell, faint but distinct. Coffee. Fresh coffee, as if someone had been brewing a pot minutes earlier. They searched every room, including the dangerous second floor, and found nothing that explained what they'd witnessed from a distance. Walsh discovered something in the upstairs bedroom that added to the mystery. An old photograph, framed and sitting on a dresser that Holstead was certain had been empty during previous searches. The photo showed a family, a couple and 2 children, standing in front of this same house. Based on the clothing and photo quality, Holstead guessed it was from the 1970s. The people looked happy, normal, completely unaware that their home would one day become the center of something unexplainable. Holstead took the photo, bagging it as evidence, though evidence of what, she wasn't sure. Research at the county records office revealed the family's identity. The house had been owned by Daniel and Martha Reeves, who'd lived there with their 2 children from 1968 until 1989. The family had left abruptly, according to old neighbors Holstead interviewed. Just packed up one winter day and moved to Wisconsin, never returning. Daniel Reeves had died in 1997, Martha in 2003. The children, now adults, lived out of state. Holstead tracked down the daughter, Elizabeth Reeves, now Elizabeth Morrison, living in Colorado. The phone conversation that followed was difficult and strange. Elizabeth was reluctant to discuss the house, her voice tight with something that sounded like old fear. But eventually she shared her story, and it made the phenomena Holstead was investigating feel much darker. "We left because of February," Elizabeth said quietly. "Every February, starting when I was about 7, the house would change at night. We'd go to bed in our normal house, and then in the middle of the night I'd wake up and it would be different. Not physically different, but occupied differently. Like there were people living there with us, people we couldn't quite see but could sense. We'd hear footsteps, voices, the sounds of normal life happening in other rooms. But when we'd investigate, we'd find nothing. Just our house, our family, nobody else." She continued, her voice shaking slightly. "It got worse every year. By the time I was 14, we could see them sometimes. Shadows that moved like people. Once, I saw a woman standing in the kitchen, facing the stove as if cooking. She was there for maybe 10 seconds, clear enough that I could see her dress, her hair. Then she just faded. My brother saw a man in the living room, reading a newspaper in a chair. My parents saw children playing in the yard, but only at night, only in winter, only in February." "Did you ever find out what was causing it?" Holstead asked. "We researched the property. The house was built in 1887 by a family named Hollister. They lived there through some of the worst winters on record. The winter of 1888, the schoolhouse blizzard, killed hundreds of people across the Great Plains. The Hollister family, parents and 3 children, died that winter, froze to death in their own home when the storm cut them off and they ran out of fuel for heat. Their bodies weren't found until spring." Elizabeth paused, and Holstead could hear her breathing, steadying herself. "After we left, I did more research. The house has been continuously occupied since it was built. Different families over the decades, but none of them stay long. And they all leave in February. The pattern goes back over 100 years. Families move in, live there fine through spring, summer, and fall. Then February comes and the phenomena starts. They usually last one winter, sometimes two, then they leave. We made it 21 years, longer than most, but that last February was too much. The shadowy people were becoming more visible, more present. We felt like we were sharing the house with something that was growing stronger, and we didn't want to find out what would happen if it became fully manifest. After the call, Holstead pulled every record she could find on the property. Elizabeth's information checked out. The Hollister family had indeed died in the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888. The house had changed hands frequently over its history, most families staying only a few years. The longest occupation was the Reeves family at 21 years. The shortest was a family in the 1920s, who moved in November and left in March, listing unsuitable conditions as their reason for breaking their lease. More disturbing was what Holstead found in old sheriff's reports. Dating back to 1912, there were periodic calls about the farmhouse on County Road 14. Complaints of trespassing, reports of lights and activity when the house was known to be empty, investigations that found nothing wrong. The pattern was clear. The phenomena occurred during vacancy periods, and only in February. When families lived there, they experienced it privately. When the house was empty, it became visible to neighbors and passers-by. Holstead spent the rest of February conducting a careful investigation, documenting every report of lights, every observation of the house. A pattern emerged. The lights appeared most frequently during the coldest nights, when temperatures dropped below -20. They were most visible between 2 and 4 a.m., the coldest hours before dawn, and they seemed to increase in frequency and intensity as February progressed, reaching a peak during the last week of the month. She set up trail cameras around the property, hoping to capture what others were seeing. The cameras recorded something, but not in the way Holstead expected. During periods when neighbors reported seeing lights, the cameras showed the house as dark. But the metadata on the images revealed something impossible. The internal camera clocks jumped during those periods. A camera set to photograph every 30 seconds would skip forward suddenly, losing anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes of time. Not a malfunction, the cameras were functioning perfectly otherwise, but a genuine gap in recorded time. As if the cameras were present for the beginning of the phenomena and the end, but not for the duration in between. Deputy Walsh made a suggestion that Holstead had been avoiding. What if we stay inside the house during one of the active periods? Actually be present when the lights come on, instead of observing from outside or arriving afterward. Holstead knew it was the logical next step, but something about the idea felt deeply wrong. Every instinct said that being inside that house when the phenomena manifested would be dangerous in ways that couldn't be predicted or prepared for. But the investigation was going nowhere with external observation. On February 24th, a night forecasted to reach -35, Holstead and Walsh entered the farmhouse and set up camp in what had been the living room. They brought equipment, cameras, recorders, temperature sensors, EMF detectors, though Holstead had no real faith any of it would capture what was happening. They also brought emergency supplies, warm clothing, flashlights, and weapons, though again, what use a firearm would be against something that existed outside normal physics, Holstead couldn't say. They settled in as darkness fell, the temperature dropping rapidly, the old house creaking and groaning around them as the cold contracted the aged wood. The first hour was uneventful. Just 2 law enforcement officers sitting in an abandoned house feeling foolish and cold despite their layered clothing. The temperature inside was barely different from outside, the house offering no protection from the brutal cold. At 2:33 a.m., everything changed. Not gradually, but instantly. One moment they were sitting in an abandoned, freezing house lit only by their flashlights. The next, they were in a furnished, warm living room with oil lamps glowing on the tables and a fire burning in the fireplace that Holstead knew was non-functional. Its chimney collapsed years ago. The shift was so complete and disorienting that Walsh gasped, her hand going to her weapon. The room around them was fully furnished with items from multiple eras. Victorian furniture mixed with pieces from the early 20th century. Photographs on the walls showed different families, different time periods, all in this same house. The warmth was immediate and real. Halstead could feel it on her skin, a dramatic change from the deadly cold of moments before. And they were no longer alone. Shadows moved in the periphery of the room, human-shaped but not quite solid. As Halstead watched, one shadow solidified briefly into a woman in a long dress, standing near the fireplace and warming her hands. The woman looked real, fully present, and she seemed unaware of Halstead and Walsh's presence. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, and Halstead could see her clearly. Dark hair, tired eyes, clothes that dated to the late 1800s. Then she faded back into shadow, but the space where she'd stood remained warm, as if her presence had physical reality. More shadows appeared. A man sitting in a chair, reading by lamplight. 2 children playing with toys on the floor. An elderly woman in the doorway to the kitchen, watching the room with sad eyes. They overlapped, existing in the same space from different time periods. The Victorian-era woman warming her hands. A 1920s family gathered around what looked like a radio. A couple from the 1960s, sitting on a couch that both existed and didn't exist in the same space as the Victorian chair. Walsh was recording everything, her camera pointing at the phenomena, her voice shaking as she narrated what they were seeing. Halstead tried her radio, but it produced only static. She checked her watch and saw the hand spinning clockwise, then counterclockwise, unable to settle on a time. The temperature sensor she'd placed in the room showed readings that fluctuated wildly, from -30 to 70 degrees and back again, as if multiple temperature states existed simultaneously. The shadows were becoming more solid, more present. Halstead could hear them now, voices that seemed to come from far away but were growing closer. A woman's voice singing a lullaby, a man's voice reading aloud, children laughing. The sounds of normal domestic life, but from different eras, all happening at once, layered over each other in a chorus of temporal overlap. Then one of the shadows looked directly at Halstead. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a dress from the 1880s. Her eyes were wide and frightened, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and immediate. "You shouldn't be here. Not when the house is remembering. Not when it's trying to stay warm. You have to leave before it takes you too." "Takes us where?" Halstead managed to ask, though her voice sounded distant in her own ears. "Into February," the girl said. "Into the cold that never ends. The house is trying to preserve us, to keep us from freezing like the first family did. It holds us in the warm times, in the moments when the house was alive and safe. But it's getting confused now. It's holding too many moments at once. If you stay, you'll become part of it. Part of the remembering. You'll be here every February, forever, trying to stay warm in a house that can't save any of us." The girl faded, and the phenomena intensified. The walls began to show multiple states at once. Freshly painted and peeling, wallpapered and bare, damaged and intact. Halstead could see through the layers, glimpsing the house as it had been different decades, all versions existing simultaneously. The floor beneath her feet felt solid and unstable at the same time, as if she were standing on a surface that couldn't decide what state of repair it should be in. "We need to leave," Walsh said urgently, moving toward where the door should be. But the door was gone, or rather, it was in multiple places at once. The current broken door, the sturdy door from decades past, no door at all but an open archway from the original construction. Walsh reached for one version and her hand passed through it like smoke. She tried another and found solid wood that wouldn't open. Halstead tried to remember the exact location of the door they'd entered through. The real door that existed in the real present. She focused on it, ignoring the overlapping versions, and found the broken door hanging on its damaged hinges. She grabbed Walsh's arm and pulled her toward it, and they stumbled through, falling into snow that was shockingly cold after the warmth inside. Behind them, the house blazed with light, every window showing different scenes from different eras. Families going about their evening routines, cooking, reading, sleeping, living lives that had ended decades ago but were somehow still happening in that structure. Halstead and Walsh ran to the cruiser, not looking back, the cold biting through their heavy clothing but feeling real and solid in a way the warmth inside had not. They sat in the cruiser, heater blasting, for nearly 20 minutes before either could speak. Walsh's camera had recorded everything, but when they reviewed the footage later, it showed only static during the period they'd been inside the manifested phenomena. The audio, however, had captured sounds. The voices, the lullaby, the child warning them to leave. And beneath it all, a deeper sound, like wind or breathing, the house itself perhaps, trying to hold warmth and life in a space where both had failed catastrophically over 100 years ago. Halstead filed a report recommending the property be permanently sealed and monitored. The house was too dangerous to demolish, she argued, as that might release whatever was trapped there, might let it spread beyond the structure's physical boundaries. Better to leave it standing, mark it as condemned, and ensure no one entered it, especially in February. Her recommendation was accepted, though her full report, the one detailing what she and Walsh had experienced, was sealed under a rarely used county ordinance that allowed sheriffs to restrict access to case files that might cause public panic. The lights continued to appear every February, visible to neighbors and passing drivers. Halstead stopped investigating them, stopped responding to calls about the house. She knew now what was happening, and she knew there was nothing law enforcement could do to stop it. The house was caught in some kind of temporal loop, preserving moments of warmth and life in response to the trauma of the Hollister family's death in 1888. Every February, as the anniversary of that death approached, the house tried harder to save them, pulling more strongly on moments when it had been warm and inhabited, creating a palimpsest of overlapping time periods all desperately seeking to escape the cold that had claimed its first occupants. Walsh left the department 6 months later, moving to a southern state where winter was measured in weeks rather than months. She told Halstead privately that she couldn't stay in a place where houses could trap you in the past, where the dead continued their routines in spaces that existed between then and now. Halstead understood, though she remained, feeling an obligation to monitor the phenomena she'd witnessed, to ensure no one else made the mistake of entering that house during its active periods. 3 years after her experience in the February house, Halstead was contacted by a paranormal research team from the university. They'd heard rumors about the property and wanted permission to investigate. She denied them, firmly and without room for negotiation. When they pressed, asking what she'd witnessed that made her so certain they shouldn't enter, she showed them the sealed report. Reading it was enough to convince them. Some mysteries, they agreed, were better left unexamined. Some phenomena existed beyond human understanding, and probing them risked becoming part of what they studied. The house stands empty now, officially condemned. A warning sign posted on the door declaring it structurally unsafe. Every February, when temperatures drop and the nights are longest, it comes alive in the only way it can. By remembering warmth, by holding moments when life thrived within its walls, by trying desperately to save families who are long dead but somehow still caught in its temporal embrace, forever seeking refuge from a cold that claimed them over a century ago and refuses to let them go. Neighbors have learned to expect the lights, to ignore the warm glow emanating from a house they know is dark and empty. It's become part of the landscape's seasonal rhythm, like snow in December or thaw in March. February means lights in the old farmhouse, shadows moving past the windows, and the understanding that some places hold on to tragedy so completely that they become trapped in it, endlessly repeating the moments before disaster, desperately trying to reach a different ending that will never come. Holstead still drives past the property sometimes, usually during February, usually late at night. She watches the lights appear and thinks about the little girl who warned her to leave, about the families trapped in overlapping moments of warmth, about a house so traumatized by failure that it can't stop trying to save people who are beyond saving. She thinks about what it means that the house is getting stronger, holding more moments simultaneously, the phenomena becoming more intense with each passing year. And she wonders what will happen when the house finally holds enough temporal power to make those preserved moments permanent, to pull living people fully into its collection of warm memories, to trap them there forever in a February that never ends, and a warmth that exists only because the house refuses to acknowledge the cold outside its walls.